This video presentation shall explain and evaluate the negotiating position of the Alliance of Small Island States, or AOSIS, in international climate change negotiations within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. This evaluation will also attempt to explain some of the key concepts in international climate change politics that are particularly relevant to AOSIS, such as global inequality, climate justice, and the global North-South divide, and the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in international climate negotiations. How the Alliance, as a negotiating coalition or voting bloc in the UNFCCC, exploit or are affected by these concepts shall also be unpacked to gain a better understanding of its negotiating position. Firstly, the stated objective of the UNFCCC is to achieve stabilisation of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, within a timeframe sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. It is from this broad objective this discussion shall originate, and sets the framework in which AOSIS's efforts in climate negotiations exist. Formed in 1990, AOSIS describes itself as a coalition of small island and low-lying coastal nations that share similar development challenges and concerns about the environment, especially their vulnerability to the adverse effects of global climate change, and functions primarily as a negotiating voice for small island developing states, or SIDS, in UNFCCC negotiations. AOSIS is primarily concerned with climate change mitigation and adaptation through deep cuts to emissions from major polluters, international cooperation on mitigation efforts, support to developing nations through managed funds and technology and information transfer, and the application of a polluter pays principle. AOSIS is comprised of 39 members and 5 observer states spread all over the world, from Africa, the Caribbean, Mediterranean, Pacific, Indian Ocean and South China Sea, and collectively comprises less than 1% of the global population and gross domestic product, and contributes about the same percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions. These member states are also highly dispersed in often isolated parts of the globe and are in varying stages of the development and diversification of their economies, although the majority are poorer nations heavily reliant on subsistence farming, agriculture and foreign aid. As a result of this diversity of membership, as well as the spectrum of social, political and cultural contexts within member states, the needs and priorities in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation will vary, posing internal challenges on the cohesion of the alliance and the broader negotiating process. So even as a coalition, AOSIS does not appear to represent a significant, cohesive and proximate global population, political force or developed economy, and hence does not seem to yield power in the traditional sense in the international relations realm. So how has this young alliance managed to become a key voice in UNFCCC negotiations? It has been argued the very conditions AOSIS nations face, such as their pre-existing vulnerability to climatic risk, high exposure to the adverse effects of climate change, and low adaptive capacity, place them in a very powerful and perhaps morally sound negotiating position in the UNFCCC, especially given their insignificant contribution to anthropogenic climate change. The AOSIS has managed to exert a profound and continuing impact on global climate policy, which Betzold 2012 refers to as a structural paradox, when a typically weak entity successfully bargains with a typically strong one. This strength is also made possible by the process of forming an alliance, as has been demonstrated by many other voting blocs in UNFCCC negotiations. Furthermore, the adverse effects of climate change on SIDS are arguably more urgent since many are low-lying island states only a few metres above sea level, and global inaction on climate change mitigation will not only threaten these states' economies and well-being, but also the very existence of their sovereign territory and nation-state due to sea level rise. Perhaps the first point in history human society will be faced with such a dire social concept as a result of climate change. Some island nations, such as Tuvalu, have already begun managed relocation efforts to New Zealand through international cooperation. However, such cooperation may not be feasible in the future, and the security issue of human migration as a result of climate change and environmental disasters has the potential to affect many regions of the world where SIDS are found. This situation perhaps adds gravity to the negotiating power of AOSIS in a way that many other nations or voting alliances cannot achieve. This power is only strengthened more by the concepts of the inherent inequality of climate change effects and the idea of international climate justice. This stems from the observed global division between developed and developing nations, commonly referred to as the global north and south respectively. The key differences that define this divide are levels of economic and social development, human and physical security, and access to food, water, shelter, employment, and educational opportunities. Global North nations are historically responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions in the atmosphere as a result of long-term fossil fuel consumption, resource extraction, and environmental degradation in the pursuit of economic development and gains. Such economic development has insulated Global North nations from the current and expected adverse impacts of climate change as a result of better access to education, shelter, employment opportunity, and well-developed government infrastructure. However, Global South nations, such as most AOSIS member nations with perhaps the exception of Singapore, do not enjoy such privilege, and their populations are highly exposed and vulnerable to climate events and effects. Thus, a high-level economic, technological, and moral responsibility for climate change effects justifiably falls on the Global North to take the lead on climate mitigation efforts, whilst acknowledging at the same time the right for developing nations to pursue and access the same living standard and economic development global nations have enjoyed for many years. When applied to the international sphere of climate mitigation and adaptation negotiations in the UNFCCC, this principle is commonly accepted and known as common but differentiated responsibility, and AOSIS are a major proponent of its recognition in their negotiating position in the UNFCCC. The negotiating position of the Alliance of Small Island States has been informed by a number of factors, namely the urgency and immediacy climate change impacts will have on its member states, many of which are low-lying islands with developing economies, and the need for the Global North to take responsibility for their historical carbon emissions and to assist developing nations such as AOSIS members to achieve sustainable development and survival. AOSIS was pivotal in taking a lead in early climate mitigation and adaptation negotiations during the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and although the international politics of climate change have changed significantly over 20 years, and its member nations are at different points in the development of their economies and their views on emerging issues, AOSIS remains a relevant, important, and active negotiating body in UNFCCC discussions. Perhaps AOSIS is a necessary entity to act as a reminder to rapidly developing nations that the effects of boundless industrial growth and development are felt all around the world in adverse ways.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, and the dreams that you dream of once in a lullaby.